Mid-toast, she smiled and said, "Some people here don't matter." Laughter broke out around the room. I lowered my glass, my hand trembling slightly, because in that instant, something inside me shifted. Something told me this wasn't just a clever quip. It was a warning. And suddenly, the entire world of crystal chandeliers, whispered conversations, and champagne flutes felt smaller, tighter, and far more dangerous than it had when I arrived. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. The room was packed with people who smiled with the practiced ease of those who always have something to hide. There was Julian, leaning back in his chair like he owned the world, a charming smile plastered over eyes that betrayed him. And there was Vivian, the one who had said the words, glowing in confidence and danger, with that knowing smile that made everyone else around her pause, even for a second. I couldn't stop staring at her, because she seemed to carry some invisible weight, some power that no one else dared name. I had come to this dinner party expecting a quiet evening. Just a chance to see faces I knew, to toast to nothing, and maybe gossip a little. I hadn't expected this. I hadn't expected to feel like a spy walking into a room where everyone had secrets they couldn't afford me discovering. Yet here I was, glass in hand, standing on the edge of a revelation I didn't yet understand. The chandeliers above sparkled like frozen stars. The kind of sparkle that seems to promise joy, but in reality, it only emphasizes the shadows lurking beneath. That's the thing about wealth and appearances. They're brilliant, shining, and intoxicating, but they cast the longest, darkest shadows. I saw them flicker on faces that smiled too widely, laughed too loudly, and clinked glasses just a fraction too deliberately. Every movement in that room was a story. Every glance, every subtle nod or tilt of the head was a calculated act. I couldn't tell who was playing a part and who was being sincere. It's a dangerous game when you're surrounded by people who have spent their lives perfecting the art of concealment. Julian, for instance, always had a way of making me feel like I was the one who didn't belong. It wasn't intentional cruelty, not exactly. It was charm with an edge, a subtle demonstration of power. He was magnetic, yes, but like a moth drawn to flame, you couldn't escape the risk of getting burned. Vivian had that same magnetism, but hers was different. Dangerous. Not the playful, teasing danger Julian exuded. Hers was the type that promised chaos if crossed. When she spoke, the air shifted. People leaned in, laughed, murmured. And I felt like an intruder in my own life. I wasn't even supposed to notice, yet there was something about her that pulled attention, forced clarity, demanded recognition. She had arrived at this dinner not as a guest, but as a catalyst. I remember the moment she raised her glass. It was elegant, almost ceremonial, like the way a general might raise a sword before battle. The room quieted, not entirely consciously, but enough that her voice carried. "Some people here don't matter," she said, and the laughter rippled like a tide breaking over stones. I didn't laugh. My glass hovered midair, frozen, as if even my hand knew that something had shifted irreversibly. And then came the questions. Why did she say that? Who did she mean? Julian's eyes flickered briefly toward her, sharp, like he'd been caught off guard, but why? I couldn't tell if it was fear, recognition, or guilt. And that's when I realized something terrifying. I didn't know anyone here as well as I thought I did. Not really. Every smile, every toast, every polite laugh might have been a mask. I had been living in a room full of strangers wearing the faces of friends. The clinking of glasses continued around me, but it sounded hollow, hollow enough that I could almost hear the truth behind it, the murmurs, the whispered judgments, the silent deals being struck while I was distracted by the sparkle of the chandelier above. I thought about Julian, about Vivian, about Eleanor, her friend who sat quietly in the corner, observing everyone with an unsettling precision. I didn't know it yet, but Eleanor knew more than she let on. About the toast, about Julian, about what everyone here thought they could hide. I remember trying to remind myself to breathe, to blend in, to let the evening pass like any other dinner party. But curiosity, dangerous, irresistible curiosity, pulled me toward observation. Every detail mattered. Every laugh, every shift in posture, Every glance exchanged across the room. And there were details. Small ones. Subtle ones. The way Eleanor's hand brushed against a folded piece of paper at her lap. The way Julian's smile didn't quite reach his eyes when Vivian spoke. The way a man at the far end of the table seemed to flinch when someone mentioned a name I didn't recognize. It was the kind of room where nothing happened by accident, and suddenly, every accident became a clue. I could feel it. Like static in the air, a hum of tension that thrummed beneath the laughter. And I knew, just knew, that by the end of this night, nothing would be the same. Not for me. Not for Julian. Not for Vivian. Not for any of them. I sipped my champagne, tasting the metallic bite of bubbles and the faint sweetness of illusion. There's something about champagne that makes people brave. Or foolish. I wasn't sure which. And as I glanced around the table, trying to place everyone in the mental map I had constructed of this social battlefield, I realized I was unprepared. Unarmed. Exposed. Vivian caught my eye across the table. She tilted her head slightly, a shadow of a smile playing at her lips, and the unspoken message hit me like a cold gust of wind. She knew I was watching. She knew I was paying attention. And in that instant, a part of me understood that the toast, her laughter, the ripple through the room, it wasn't just a comment on someone else. It was a declaration. A challenge. And me? I had been summoned, whether I wanted to be or not. That's when the first ripple of fear, tinged with curiosity, ran through me. Because I knew this dinner wasn't going to be about champagne or polite conversation. It was going to be about secrets. About betrayals. About the unspoken agreements that had kept this room in balance. Agreements that Vivian had just detonated with a single sentence. I lowered my glass fully then, the movement deliberate, slow, as though the act of touching down the crystal rim was grounding me to reality. But reality, I realized, had shifted. And the longer I stayed in that room, the deeper I would be drawn into a web I couldn't see yet, couldn't escape, and maybe didn't even want to. I don't know why I stayed. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was some instinctive desire to witness the unraveling. Or maybe, deep down, I knew that in order to understand the toast, I would have to understand the people in the room, their motives, their fears, and the betrayals they'd carried quietly for years. And so the night stretched out before me, a sequence of small, perfect explosions of tension, laughter, and observation. Each clink of a glass, each whispered word, each glance that lingered too long or too briefly, I catalogued it all. Every movement became a story waiting to be told. Every word, a weapon or a shield. But I didn't know yet that the toast was only the beginning. That Vivian's smile, the laughter, the seeming frivolity of the moment, was the spark that would ignite everything hidden in that room. That the people I thought I knew were shadows, and that shadows hide truths that light will eventually reveal. And as I raised my glass one last time to myself, whispering under my breath, I realized I had walked into a room full of people who didn't matter, and yet, somehow, I mattered more than I knew. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The moment Vivian raised her glass, everything else in the room seemed to fade. The chandeliers glinted in fragmented reflections, the silver cutlery caught sparks of light, and the laughter of the guests became a distant echo. But her words, simple, sharp, lethal, cut through the hum of polite conversation like a knife. Some people here don't matter. The room erupted, half in laughter, half in stunned silence, but I didn't join. I couldn't. My glass hovered in midair, the champagne inside trembling slightly as if it, too, understood the gravity of the statement. I had been at countless parties, dinners, and gatherings, and yet never had a single sentence made the room feel so small, so precarious. Everyone froze for a moment. Julian, seated beside me, gave a tight-lipped smile, but his eyes flickered with something I couldn't immediately name. Recognition? Fear? Guilt? Or perhaps a mix of all three. I tried to focus on the mechanics of the room to distract myself. The subtle arch of a brow, the tilt of a head, the quick glance exchanged between Eleanor and Vivian, details I would normally miss, but tonight, nothing escaped me. Every movement was charged with meaning, every smile a potential mask. And in that charged atmosphere, I realized that Vivian's toast wasn't a casual remark. It was a signal. Something had been set into motion, and I was standing right in the epicenter of it. Julian leaned toward me, whispering in a tone too casual to be believable, "Ignore her. She likes the drama." But I knew better. I had learned the hard way that when Vivian orchestrated a moment like this, it was never just a game. Someone was being marked. And I had a sinking suspicion that I wasn't the only one watching. The other guests began to murmur among themselves. The laughter was polite but strained, each person carefully measuring their responses. Vivian's eyes swept across the room like a conductor, orchestrating reactions with precision. I could feel the tension stretching from one side of the table to the other. The air smelled faintly of expensive perfume and candle wax, but beneath it, there was an unmistakable undertone: anticipation. Something was about to happen, and I was caught in the first ripple. I thought I knew Julian. I thought I understood the subtle rhythms of his charm, the way he could disarm a room with a well-timed joke or a casual glance. But Vivian had thrown everything into disarray. I saw the faintest twitch in his jaw, the way his fingers tapped nervously against the stem of his wine glass. For the first time in years, I realized that Julian had an Achilles heel, and Vivian knew exactly where it was. I tried to keep my focus on the edges of the room, scanning the other guests. There was Eleanor, of course, sitting gracefully but with eyes that missed nothing. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, but her fingers brushed against something, a folded note, perhaps a list, perhaps a warning. Then there was Marcus, the man in the corner who always looked like he had stepped out of a magazine cover, but whose smile never reached his eyes. And across the table, faintly in the shadows, a woman I didn't recognize. Her eyes locked on Vivian, but there was fear there, not admiration. "What do you think she meant?" I whispered to Julian, barely moving my lips, trying to keep my voice low enough that no one else could hear. "Vivian likes to rattle people," he replied, but his own voice betrayed uncertainty. He was lying, or maybe just afraid of what Vivian might reveal next. And then it happened. The first ripple of chaos. Eleanor, whom I had thought was merely observing, rose smoothly from her chair. Everyone thought she was heading to the restroom or perhaps to retrieve a drink, but I saw the subtle tension in the way she held herself. There was intent behind every movement, a precision that hinted at prior knowledge. And I realized with a jolt that Eleanor was a player, not a bystander. Vivian's eyes followed her, and I swear there was something almost predatory in her smile. She wasn't just making a statement. She was sending a message. And in the way the guests reacted, some flinching, some laughing nervously, some whispering, I began to understand that the toast was more than a sentence. It was a weapon, and it had already struck. I tried to sip my champagne again, to ground myself, but my hand shook. The bubbles rose in the glass like tiny reminders of the tension I could feel in the room. I kept my eyes on Julian, and then my gaze wandered back to Vivian. There was a calmness about her that didn't match the ripple of disruption she had just caused. That calmness was terrifying. I knew instinctively that she wasn't going to stop at a single toast. This was the opening move, and she had already won the first round. The room was alive now. Not in the way a party usually is, with laughter and easy conversation. It was alive with hidden agendas, secrets, and the unsaid. Every laugh sounded sharper, every glance more loaded. I realized then that the room had been a battlefield long before I arrived, and I had unknowingly stepped into the middle of it. Julian, trying to regain his composure, attempted a joke, something about champagne making everything more dramatic. The laughter that followed was hollow, perfunctory. I noticed how Marcus's eyes narrowed subtly, how a few of the guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. The joke had landed, but it had landed like a pebble thrown into a storm. The chaos wasn't over, it had just begun. I felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. I wanted to leave, to escape the tension that pulsed like electricity in the air, but a part of me couldn't. I needed to see what happened next. I needed to watch Vivian work, to see the ripple of consequences that followed a single, devastating line. Then, in the corner of my eye, I saw it. A small movement, almost imperceptible, but deliberate. Eleanor had slipped the folded note into her clutch and returned to her seat, her expression neutral. But I had seen it. I had seen the evidence of a secret, and it made my pulse quicken. What did the note say? Who was it for? And how much of the room's laughter and politeness was a carefully crafted illusion, masking a storm that no one else could see yet? I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, trying to remind myself that I was just a guest. Just a spectator. But deep down, I knew I was already entangled. Vivian's toast had ensnared me, pulled me into a web of intrigue, and I couldn't untangle myself without risking exposure, humiliation, or worse. The night stretched ahead, each moment pregnant with possibility and danger. Every gesture, every whispered conversation, every flicker of emotion was a clue. And I knew that the toast was only the beginning. The first crack in a carefully constructed facade that would soon crumble in ways I couldn't yet imagine. And just as I thought I might finally relax, to blend into the background once more, Vivian's eyes met mine across the table. That smile again, calm, knowing, unrelenting. She raised her glass slightly in my direction, and I felt it like a challenge, like an unspoken question. Were you paying attention? Could you see it coming? I swallowed hard, feeling the champagne burn my throat, and realized with a jolt, I wasn't just a guest tonight. I was a witness, a participant, and perhaps, without realizing it yet, a target. But what happened next, the secret that would unravel everything, no one could have predicted. I couldn't shake the feeling that the toast had been just the opening act. There was a rhythm to the room now, a subtle undercurrent that pulled at me, whispering that everything I thought I knew was only surface deep. Vivian's smile lingered in my mind, sharp and deliberate, like a warning carved into the air. And then, almost imperceptibly, Eleanor moved. She rose smoothly from her seat, her movements fluid, practiced, almost predatory. The other guests barely noticed or pretended not to because in this room, pretending was the currency of survival. She was heading toward the far corner, clutching something small in her hand. My curiosity wouldn't let me ignore it. I had no right to follow her, but instinct took over. I trailed her silently, weaving between chairs and tables, careful not to draw attention. Every step felt amplified in the silence between the laughter and clinking glasses. Eleanor glanced around casually, but her eyes always seemed to find me, those sharp, calculating eyes, and I realized she knew I was watching. I wondered, for the first time, if she had planned for me to follow. In the corner, she paused. The note, or whatever it was, slipped from her clutch into the folds of a velvet curtain. She lingered there, as if to confirm no one saw her, and then returned to her seat, posture perfect, expression unreadable. I had seen enough. Something important had just passed through her hands, and I had no idea what it was. My pulse quickened. Who was the intended recipient? And what secrets did it contain that could destabilize an entire room? I moved back to my seat, trying to appear casual, but my mind raced. Every glance, every hushed tone, every subtle gesture could now hold new significance. This wasn't just a dinner party anymore. It was a stage, a puzzle, and I had just glimpsed one of the pieces. I wasn't sure if the puzzle would save anyone or destroy them, but the edges were sharp enough to cut. Julian leaned toward me again, whispering, "Don't get involved." His voice sounded calm, almost too calm. I knew better. Calm words in this room were rarely what they seemed. He wanted me to stay away, but curiosity is stronger than caution when the stakes are this high. I had already crossed the line. And then the whispers started. Subtle, almost like the rustling of silk across the polished floors, words carried in fragmented sentences. She knows. It's coming. Careful what you say. I caught snippets here and there. Names I recognized and some I didn't. One of the guests, a woman in a soft blue gown, was suddenly pale, glancing at Eleanor as if realizing something had been taken from her. I couldn't tell if it was fear or guilt or both. I tried to catalog what I saw. Vivian sat across the room, untouched by the chaos she had incited, her glass raised slightly, her lips curved in that same unnervingly calm smile. Every laugh, every whisper seemed to orbit around her, yet she remained the eye of the storm. I realized with a cold clarity that she wasn't here to enjoy a party. She was here to reveal, to test, and to control. Curiosity clawed at me, stronger than any instinct for safety. I had to know what Eleanor had done. I had to understand what Vivian was orchestrating. I moved toward the velvet curtain, pretending to admire the glinting silverware, but my eyes stayed on the folds. Something had been hidden there, something important and possibly dangerous. I felt a thrill, equal parts fear and anticipation. As I edged closer, I realized that the room had transformed. Every guest was no longer just a participant in polite conversation. They were players in a game, each maneuvering for advantage. The laughter had become camouflage, the smile shields. I began to notice subtle patterns. A hand lingering too long on a glass, eyes darting to the far corner when no one was looking, hushed tones that stopped mid-word when someone approached. I was observing a room full of people who had spent years perfecting deception, and I was the intruder in their carefully choreographed world. And then I saw something that made my stomach twist. Julian was speaking to someone I hadn't noticed before, a man leaning casually against the wall. The conversation seemed innocent, but the way Julian's eyes flicked toward Vivian with a flash of unease told me otherwise. I didn't know what was being said, but I understood one thing clearly. Julian was hiding something. And Vivian, with that unrelenting gaze, already knew. I tried to keep my composure, sipping the champagne that suddenly tasted bitter in my mouth. The notes of sweetness and bubbles were swallowed by tension, and I felt like I was balancing on a knife's edge. One wrong move, one glance, one overheard word could unravel everything. But I couldn't stop myself from watching, listening, and piecing together the fragments of information. Then came the most unnerving moment. Eleanor leaned over slightly, whispering something to Vivian. Their exchange was barely audible, but I caught enough to know that whatever was said confirmed a secret I didn't yet understand. Vivian's smile widened slightly, almost imperceptibly, and I realized she was pleased. This wasn't a coincidence. Every move Eleanor made, every small secret she carried, was feeding into Vivian's plan. I glanced at Julian, who seemed oblivious, or maybe he was pretending to be. The man I thought I knew, the charming, confident Julian, was suddenly vulnerable. He shifted in his chair, trying to maintain his composure, but I noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers tapped nervously against the stem of his glass. Something in the room had changed, and he knew it. I leaned back slightly, pretending to engage in polite conversation with the guest beside me, but my mind was racing. Every small movement, every whispered word, every glance exchanged across the table was part of a larger picture I could only glimpse. And that picture was dangerous. I realized then that the note, Eleanor, and Vivian's toast were all connected. A thread I could see stretching through the room, tying together hidden truths, past betrayals, and impending revelations. And I was standing at the center of it, watching the web spin tighter, faster, more inevitable with every passing second. I had to know more. I had to see the next move. And yet, a part of me wanted to turn away, to escape the tension, the secrets, and the danger that pulsed like electricity in the room. I knew I couldn't leave, not without understanding what had been set into motion, and not without risking becoming a target myself. And just as I leaned forward, trying to catch another detail, I felt a subtle pressure behind me, a presence, a reminder that I was being watched as closely as I watched the others. I turned slightly, just enough to catch a shadow move along the far wall, fleeting and deliberate. Someone else knew I was paying attention. Someone else was tracking me. The room had shifted again. What had started as a simple dinner party was now a labyrinth of secrets, lies, and unspoken threats. Every smile was a ruse, every conversation a trap, and every gesture held hidden meaning. And I realized, with a chill that ran down my spine, that the next revelation could change everything. And I might not be ready for it. But what I didn't know yet, what none of us could have known, was that the first real shock of the night hadn't even happened. And when it did, it would shatter the fragile balance of power in the room, leaving nothing as it had been. The room felt smaller now, tighter, like the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. Vivian's toast had been the spark, but the fire was spreading quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the murmurs that rippled beneath polite laughter. I could hear it if I tried, the hushed tones, the pauses, the deliberate cadence of people who were trying, desperately, not to reveal too much. But everyone in that room was a liar, in some shape or form, and I had learned early that lies tend to tangle themselves in predictable patterns. I leaned back slightly, pretending to sip my champagne, but my attention was razor-sharp. Julian, still sitting beside me, seemed calmer on the surface, but his fingers were tapping against the stem of his glass. Not casually. Nervously. I could feel it. Something had shifted, something he didn't want me or anyone else to notice. And I knew instinctively that Vivian already knew too. Then it happened. A whisper. So soft I almost thought I had imagined it. But the tone, the barely there urgency, made me freeze. Eleanor, sitting across the table, leaned slightly toward Vivian, and their exchange was barely audible, but enough for me to catch fragments. He doesn't know, yet, and soon. The words were harmless on the surface, yet they carried a weight that pressed against my chest. The kind of weight that tells you everything is about to change. I tried to focus on the edges of the conversation, but even the background noise seemed charged now. Someone clinked a glass too loudly. A laugh cracked at the wrong moment. It all felt like signals, a coded language of the powerful, spoken in a room where secrets were more valuable than money. I noticed Marcus again, the man in the corner who always looked composed, like he had stepped straight out of a magazine. Tonight, though, his composure was cracking. He kept glancing at Julian, and the way he shifted in his seat suggested he knew something. He wasn't just observing. He was calculating, plotting, and perhaps waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And I realized that I had stumbled into the middle of something far bigger than a single toast or whispered exchange. Curiosity clawed at me. I couldn't help myself. I leaned slightly, trying to catch more of Eleanor and Vivian's whispered conversation, hoping for a clue. And then I heard it. Julian's voice, low, deceptively casual, but threaded with something sharp. He was talking to someone I hadn't noticed before, a man leaning against the wall near the far side of the room. Their words were fragmented, but I caught enough to know this wasn't idle chatter. There was guilt, there was fear, and there was complicity. And suddenly, Julian, the man I thought I knew, was a stranger. I swallowed hard, feeling my pulse spike. The whispers weren't just words, they were weapons. And every word in that room had the potential to hurt, to expose, to ruin. I couldn't look away. I tried to ground myself, pretending to laugh at a joke someone else made, but my mind was racing, cataloging each movement, each glance, each syllable of conversation. And then a voice, sharp and deliberate, cut through my attention. "Clara, are you even listening?" Julian's tone was casual, almost teasing, but I caught the tension underneath. He was trying to distract me, to pull me back into the illusion of normalcy. But I couldn't go back. Not now. I had seen too much, noticed too much. The room was no longer just a room. It was a stage, a battlefield, and I was a participant whether I liked it or not. I turned my gaze subtly back to Eleanor. She was calm, serene even, but there was something in the tilt of her head, the brush of her fingers across her clutch, that screamed danger. She wasn't just a witness. She was an active player in the unfolding drama. And I realized, with a chilling clarity, that whatever Vivian had planned, Eleanor was an essential part of it. I glanced across the room again, noticing subtle interactions I hadn't seen before. Two guests at the far end were speaking in hushed tones, their conversation interrupted every few seconds by glances toward Vivian. It was like watching chess pieces move across a board, each person executing moves that only made sense in the context of the larger game. And the more I watched, the more I realized that everyone in that room had something to hide, something to protect, and something to gain. My mind drifted back to Vivian. She was sitting there, calm, almost untouchable, watching the room with an intensity that was unsettling. Her presence was magnetic, yes, but also terrifying. She seemed to know everything, predict everything, and control the flow of information without ever raising her voice. That kind of power was intoxicating. And dangerous. I could see why everyone responded to her, why Eleanor followed her lead so precisely. And I understood, in that moment, that I was witnessing not just a social gathering, but a masterclass in manipulation and strategy. The whispers grew louder in my mind than in reality. Every fragment of conversation felt loaded with hidden meaning. I thought about the note Eleanor had slipped earlier, about the way she had moved, about Vivian's deliberate toast. And it all started to connect in a way that was both terrifying and thrilling. I had glimpsed the edges of a conspiracy, the outlines of a secret that could topple reputations, destroy relationships, and shift power in an instant. And then, just as I began to feel like I was piecing it together, something caught my eye, a subtle gesture from Julian. His hand brushed against something beneath the table, something concealed from view. I couldn't see what it was, but I knew instinctively that it mattered. The tension in his posture, the way his eyes flicked toward Vivian and then away, all told me that he was hiding more than he should. I felt a jolt of fear, mixed with curiosity. I knew I should ignore it, focus on my own safety, blend into the background. But I couldn't. Not when the stakes were this high, not when I was already in the middle of something I didn't fully understand. Every whispered word, every small gesture, every glance across the table was a thread, and I had just begun to follow the tapestry they wove together. And then the moment that made my heart stop, Vivian's gaze shifted, and for just a second, it met mine. That smile again, calm, deliberate, almost sinister, sent a shiver down my spine. It was a warning, a challenge, an unspoken question. Can you see what's happening? Can you handle it? Can you survive what comes next? I took a breath, feeling my pulse hammering, and realized that the night was far from over. The whispers, the hidden notes, the secrets, they were all building toward something inevitable. And when that something came, it wouldn't just disrupt the party. It would shatter it. But what came next, the first truth to emerge from the shadows, would be far more shocking than any of us imagined. The tension in the room had become almost tangible, like static electricity in the air before a storm. Every glass clinked with the weight of hidden agendas, every laugh carried a subtle accusation, and every smile hid a threat. I had been trying to remain invisible, to observe without becoming part of the chaos. But in this room, invisibility was impossible. Vivian's presence demanded attention, and her words, even whispered, reverberated like ripples across a pond. It started small, a glass of red wine, carelessly placed at the edge of the table by a waiter. Marcus, ever the perfectionist, reached for it just as another guest brushed past, jostling the delicate crystal. The wine tipped, spilling across the polished white tablecloth, a dark red stain blooming like a warning. The room froze. Conversations faltered. Eyes flicked to the spill, and then, almost immediately, to the source. "What a mess," someone murmured, but it was more than a comment. It was a spark, a trigger. Julian, seated beside me, leaned forward, trying to contain the situation. His charm, usually so effortless, felt forced. He apologized to the waiter, to Marcus, to anyone who would glance in his direction, but the room's undercurrent had shifted. That small, accidental spill became a stage for tension, and, suddenly, a confrontation was inevitable. I watched as Vivian's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, just enough to indicate she was aware of the subtle chaos, just enough to suggest she found it amusing. Eleanor, ever precise, leaned back in her chair, folding her hands with deceptive calm. But I could see it in her eyes, a flicker of calculation, a silent acknowledgement that something significant had just begun. The argument started innocently enough, polite words exchanged with false smiles. But the tension escalated quickly. Marcus accused the guest who had bumped the table of carelessness. using words that were polite but sharp. The guest, a woman in a green gown with a veneer of civility, fired back with a subtle jab, something that sounded innocent to the untrained ear but was a direct hit in the social battlefield. Voices rose, tones sharpened, and the laughter around us became strained, nervous, a mask barely holding back a storm. I felt my heart race. This was the first real explosion in the room, and it was tiny, almost laughable, but it revealed everything. How fragile the facade of civility truly was. How easily control could slip. And more importantly, how calculated Vivian's plan had always been. She had ignited the spark, and now the fire was spreading. Julian, sensing the escalating drama, tried to intervene. "It's just a spill," he said, voice smooth but tense, the practiced charm of a man used to diffusing tension. But it didn't work. The spill had become a battleground, a symbol, a microcosm of everything hidden in the room: betrayal, secrets, pride, and fear. And then came the twist. Eleanor, who had remained calm, stepped into the fray, not to calm, but to manipulate. Her words were subtle, carefully chosen, directing blame with such finesse that the room's attention shifted subtly toward one unsuspecting guest. The woman in the green gown stiffened, realizing she was being set up, but before she could respond, Eleanor had already moved on, her composure perfect, her influence invisible but undeniable. I could feel a mixture of fear and awe. Eleanor was dangerous, and not in a brute force way. She wielded power quietly, elegantly, and without detection. I realized then that the note she had slipped earlier, the careful movements, the subtle gestures, they all pointed to a larger plan. And I had stumbled unwillingly right into its center. My attention flicked back to Vivian. She watched the chaos with that unnerving calm, that smile that could be both invitation and threat. She had orchestrated this moment perfectly. The spill, the argument, the manipulation, it wasn't accidental. It was performance art, and we were all actors without realizing it. I tried to refocus on Julian, hoping for some anchor in the storm. But he was unraveling, just slightly, imperceptibly at first. His jaw tightened. His fingers tapped against the stem of his glass in a nervous rhythm. His eyes flitted toward Vivian more than once, and I realized with a jolt that he was aware of something I wasn't. And that his awareness terrified him. It wasn't long before whispers started spreading. Small, careful murmurs, half-heard, creating paranoia in every corner of the room. Names were mentioned, hinted at, connections implied. I caught fragments. "Did you know?" And "I can't believe she," and "he's hiding." Each fragment was a seed of suspicion, planting doubt in the minds of every guest. And I realized that by simply observing, by noticing the whispers, I had become entangled in their web. I moved subtly, pretending to adjust my place setting, but my ears strained to catch everything. Every gesture, every glance, every word mattered. And then, in a moment that made my stomach drop, I noticed Julian speaking quietly to someone in the far corner, his expression tight with tension. The conversation was brief, but the urgency in his eyes made me realize he was trying to prevent something I didn't yet understand. Just as I leaned forward to see more, a soft but deliberate touch on my shoulder made me freeze. I turned slowly, and there was Vivian, standing there with the same unrelenting smile. "I see you've noticed," she said quietly, almost teasing, almost threatening. There was no anger in her tone, no malice, just certainty. She knew I was watching. She knew I had seen Eleanor's subtle maneuvers. And somehow I felt exposed, as if I had been caught peeking behind the curtains of the carefully constructed performance. I nodded subtly, unsure what else to do, and she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod before stepping back. My heart was pounding. Vivian's presence alone made everything more dangerous, more real. Her smile lingered in my mind, and I realized that the night wasn't just about small dramas, it was about control. She had orchestrated every nuance, every ripple, every tension, and we were all caught in the undertow. And then came the final jolt of the evening's first act. A loud gasp from across the room, a sudden shout, and the argument over the spilled wine escalated into chaos. Guests were rising, voices raised, accusations flying. Marcus's face was red, the woman in green's composure cracked, and somewhere beneath it all, Eleanor's careful manipulation still guided the storm. I took a step back, realizing that the room I had entered as a dinner party was now a battlefield of egos, secrets, and betrayal. And as I caught Julian's eyes once more, I knew that nothing would ever be the same. The first explosion of drama had occurred. But the real storm, the one that would expose secrets, betrayals, and truths, was still waiting to be unleashed. And I knew, deep in my bones, that when it came, I would not be able to look away. The chaos from the spilled wine had finally started to settle, but the tension in the room didn't diminish, it only thickened, like smoke clinging to the walls. Everyone was talking, but no one was really saying anything. Eyes flicked over shoulders, hands fidgeted with glasses and napkins, and in every smile, I could sense hidden calculations. The first act of drama was over, but the real performance, the one that would expose the undercurrents of deceit, was just beginning. I kept my attention on Eleanor. Even amidst the noise, she remained the calmest person in the room, an island of composure. Her movements were precise, deliberate, and terrifyingly controlled. She wasn't just observing the chaos, she was engineering it, orchestrating it from behind the scenes, pulling invisible strings that directed attention, blame, and fear with the faintest gestures. I couldn't take my eyes off her. And then I remembered the note she had slipped into the velvet curtain earlier. My curiosity burned. I had seen her hand move, but not the message. What secrets had been written there? Who was the intended recipient? And how much did Vivian already know? I knew I had to find out. Slowly, I made my way toward the corner where Eleanor had left it. The velvet curtain was heavy and rich, its folds hiding more than just fabric. I hesitated, heart hammering, knowing that a single wrong move could draw attention. I glanced around. Vivian was talking with Julian, laughing lightly, utterly unaware of my approach, or at least pretending to be. The perfect moment. I reached out, brushing the folds of the curtain aside, and there it was, the note, small and folded with meticulous care. My fingers trembled as I unfolded it, revealing a few lines of handwriting that immediately made my pulse quicken. Names, dates, locations. Cryptic at first, but before I could process it fully, a shadow fell across the note. I looked up, heart in my throat. Eleanor stood there, calm as ever, her eyes unreadable. "Curiosity is dangerous," she said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper, but sharp enough to slice through my nerves. I realized then that she had known I would find the note, had perhaps anticipated it, and now I was in her trap. I swallowed hard, forcing my composure. I didn't mean," I started, but she held up a hand. "No need to explain," she said. "Just remember what you've seen. Some truths are heavier than they seem. And some people will do anything to protect them." Her words hung in the air like a warning. I felt the weight of the secret pressing down on me, a pressure I couldn't shake. The note had revealed alliances and betrayals I hadn't even imagined, and now that knowledge marked me. I was no longer a mere observer. I was implicated. I folded the note quickly and slipped it into my clutch, trying to appear casual. But Eleanor's eyes followed me, unwavering. I understood immediately. I was under surveillance, and my next moves would be watched closely. Returning to my seat, I tried to calm my racing heart, to regain some semblance of normalcy. Julian noticed immediately. His eyes flicked toward my clutch, then back to me, his expression tightening ever so slightly. He knew something had shifted. He didn't know what I had found, but he could feel it. And in that room, sensing a secret was sometimes as dangerous as revealing one. The party resumed, at least outwardly. Laughter returned, conversations flowed, glasses clinked, but the undercurrent remained. Everyone in that room had secrets, and now I held one that could unravel the delicate balance. I felt the pressure of knowledge, the weight of responsibility, and the fear that my curiosity had just put me in the crosshairs of people capable of anything. Then came the subtle signs I had been anticipating. Marcus, who had remained quiet after the earlier chaos, made a discreet gesture toward the far end of the room. The woman in green tensed, her eyes starting toward him. Julian's expression hardened, and Vivian, seated at the center of it all, raised her glass in a gesture that seemed innocent, but to anyone paying attention, it was a signal. I realized with a shiver that the room had shifted again. Alliances were being tested, loyalties questioned, and hidden enemies revealed. Everyone was moving in this invisible dance, and the note I had found was the catalyst. I had stepped into a storm of secrets, a labyrinth of betrayal, and there was no turning back. I tried to focus, to piece together the patterns. Names, dates, relationships, it all connected. Julian, Marcus, Eleanor, Vivian, they were all part of a hidden network, each playing a role in a game I was only beginning to understand. The stakes were enormous, the consequences potentially catastrophic. And then came the most unnerving realization of all. Someone else had seen me with the note. A flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, subtle but deliberate, confirmed it. My pulse quickened. Whoever had noticed was calculating, watching, waiting for the right moment to act. And in a room full of players who thrived on secrets, being seen with knowledge was dangerous. I tried to steady my breathing, to remain calm, but I felt the tension coil tighter around me. Every whisper, every glance, every gesture now carried a threat. The game had shifted. I was no longer just an observer. I was a participant, a potential pawn, and perhaps even a target. Vivian caught my eye across the table, her smile calm, almost imperceptibly amused. I understood immediately, she knew. She had known all along that I would discover the note, and now the next phase of the night was beginning. The subtle power she wielded was intoxicating and terrifying. And then it happened, a sudden, sharp gasp from across the room. Everyone froze, their eyes drawn to a new development that none of us had anticipated. The tension snapped, the web of whispers and lies vibrating with a new energy. Something was about to be revealed, something that would change everything in that room. I swallowed hard, gripping my clutch. The note, the whispers, the subtle alliances, they had all led to this moment. And I realized, with a chill that ran down my spine, that what came next would expose truths far darker than I had imagined. But no one in the room, not even Vivian or Eleanor, was prepared for what would happen next. The gasp had rippled through the room like a sudden gust of wind in a silent forest. Conversations froze mid-sentence, glasses paused in midair, and every pair of eyes turned toward the source. I had felt it coming, an escalation, but nothing could have prepared me for the sheer force of what was about to unfold. Secrets that had been whispered in hushed tones, carefully hidden behind laughter and polished smiles, were about to be exposed, and the shockwave would reach everyone in the room. I gripped my clutch tightly, the note Eleanor had left burning in my pocket. Every word, every detail, suddenly felt heavier, as if the paper itself carried the weight of what was coming. My pulse raced, and I realized, with a jolt, that I was no longer an observer. I was a participant in the unmasking of carefully constructed facades, and the consequences were terrifying. Vivian stood first, gracefully, as though the room had been waiting for her cue. Her eyes swept over the assembled guests, calm and piercing, and her smile carried an edge that cut deeper than any words could. "Well," she began, voice smooth and deliberate, "I think it's time we stop pretending." A ripple of unease traveled through the crowd. The first murmurs were soft, questioning, but the tension escalated quickly. Julian's confident composure faltered slightly. Marcus straightened, suddenly aware that he, too, was under scrutiny. Even Eleanor's calm expression held a flicker of calculation, as if she were preparing for a counterplay. Vivian wasn't just speaking, she was dismantling, revealing, exposing. She paused, letting the silence stretch. It was a masterstroke, a calculated move that made every guest shift nervously. And then she spoke again, her words precise, sharp, and devastating. "Some alliances here are not what they seem. Some loyalties are bought, borrowed, or feigned. And some truths have been hidden far too long." The room went quiet. A single dropped fork clattered to the floor, sounding like a gunshot in the charged air. Eyes darted between guests, searching for signs of guilt or recognition. I could feel the tension coil around me, pressing against my chest. Every movement, every glance was a potential revelation, every gesture a potential betrayal. I caught Julian's eye for the first time since the evening began. His confident smile was gone, replaced by a thin, tight line. There was fear there now, subtle but undeniable, and I realized he knew that Vivian's words weren't random. They were deliberate, aimed to expose, to destabilize, to unmask the carefully hidden dynamics of the room. And then it happened. Eleanor, calm and precise as ever, made her move. She rose smoothly, approaching Vivian with the grace of a dancer, but with a purpose that was unmistakable. The room watched, holding its collective breath, as she produced a small envelope, elegant and unassuming. Without a word, she handed it to Vivian, who accepted it with that same unflinching calm. Vivian's eyes flicked over the envelope, then back to the room. A subtle shift in her expression told me everything I needed to know. The contents were explosive, and as she began to speak again, this time reading aloud, the atmosphere changed. Names were mentioned. Events were recounted. Secrets that had been whispered behind closed doors were laid bare for everyone to see. I felt my stomach drop. The first revelation was damning enough to send anyone reeling. Marcus stiffened, his carefully constructed persona cracking. The woman in green paled, realizing that her carefully hidden indiscretions were now exposed. Julian's jaw tightened, and I could see the tension in his shoulders, the silent acknowledgement that he, too, was vulnerable. And yet, the most astonishing part wasn't the individual revelations. It was the connections, the intricate web of alliances, betrayals, and hidden agendas that Vivian unveiled. Every relationship, every whispered deal, every subtle act of manipulation was now visible, laid bare under the harsh light of scrutiny. It was dazzling and terrifying, a social exposé of the highest order. I glanced at Eleanor. She remained composed, her calm mask never faltering, but I could see the faintest flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. She had delivered the envelope with precision, anticipating every ripple of reaction, every gasp, every glance. She was a master of the shadows, and I had seen it firsthand. Julian, sensing the gravity of the moment, tried to intervene. His voice was low, smooth, and controlled, attempting to shift the focus, to mitigate the damage. But it was too late. Vivian's words had taken root. The unmasking was underway, and no charm or deflection could undo what had been revealed. I realized, with a mixture of fear and exhilaration, that the game in this room was no longer subtle. The stakes had escalated beyond polite intrigue and strategic whispers. Lives, reputations, and alliances were being rewritten in real time, and everyone in the room, including myself, was caught in the fallout. And then came the moment that made my heart nearly stop. Vivian's gaze met mine. That calm, piercing stare, paired with a knowing smile, carried an unspoken warning. She knew I had seen the note. She knew I understood the connections. And in that instant, I realized the unmasking wasn't over, not for anyone, and certainly not for me. A sudden murmur rose from the back of the room. Someone had stepped forward, emboldened or desperate, and the tension snapped to a new level. Secrets that had been unspoken were now being challenged openly, accusations flying, voices raised. The room became a whirlwind of revelation and emotion, a storm no one could control. And in the middle of it all, I felt the pulse of something even more dangerous. A hidden truth that Vivian had not yet revealed, one that would change everything once it came to light. I could sense it, like a shadow moving behind the chaos, waiting for the right moment to strike. The unmasking had begun. But the full truth, the devastating, world-altering truth, was still hidden, waiting in the wings. And when it was finally revealed, the room, and everyone in it, would never be the same again. The room had descended into chaos, yet somehow order remained. A twisted balance that only Vivian could maintain. Voices clashed, whispers collided, and accusations ricocheted like shrapnel, but underneath it all, I could sense the invisible lines of power shifting. Secrets had been unmasked, alliances exposed, and yet there was something still lurking, something darker, more dangerous, waiting to be revealed. I felt it immediately. A tension deeper than what the spill, the whispered notes, and the public accusations had caused. It wasn't just the social battlefield anymore. This was something personal, something calculated. Vivian had been preparing for this moment all along, and now the hidden threat was ready to surface. Julian's usual charm was gone, replaced by sharp, measured movements. He had recovered slightly from the unmasking, but there was a new wariness in his eyes. His attention flicked constantly to Vivian, to Eleanor, and then, subtly, to me. It was clear that he suspected I knew more than I should. Every gesture, every glance carried unspoken warnings. Be careful. This is bigger than you imagine. And then, a new player entered the scene, a man who had been invisible until now, lurking in the shadows, observing quietly. I didn't know his name, but his presence shifted the energy in the room. He didn't speak at first. He simply walked slowly toward the center, eyes scanning, calculating, and measuring reactions. And when he finally spoke, his words cut through the tension like a knife. "Enough games," he said, voice low, smooth, and deliberate. "It's time the real truth comes out." The room froze. Even Vivian, who seemed untouchable until now, paused, her calm smile unwavering, but her eyes sharpening. I could feel the collective intake of breath, the silent acknowledgement that something far more dangerous than a social power struggle was now unfolding. Eleanor's composure remained intact, but I noticed a subtle shift. The calmness that had carried her through every moment of manipulation flickered briefly, like a candle struggling against the wind. She knew this was different. The hidden threat had been revealed, and it wasn't something anyone could control. The man stepped forward, producing a document from his coat. The paper was unassuming, yet the weight it carried was undeniable. He spread it across the table, revealing a series of connections, betrayals, and plans that none of us had anticipated. And then the room understood. The document detailed a conspiracy that reached far beyond the dinner party. It linked Julian, Marcus, and even some guests who had appeared innocent to a scheme designed to manipulate, betray, and control in ways that were chilling. Every name, every date, every note was a revelation that shattered trust and loyalty. The truth was staggering and horrifying. Vivian leaned forward slightly, reading over the man's shoulder. Her expression remained calm, but her eyes were sharp, predatory. She didn't flinch, didn't falter, and yet I could see her processing, calculating, planning the next move. Eleanor, ever composed, began to whisper to Vivian, strategizing, coordinating in ways invisible to everyone else. Julian's reaction was subtle but unmistakable. His confidence, already shaken by the earlier unmasking, crumbled further. He clenched his jaw, shifting uneasily in his chair, realizing that the carefully constructed facade he had maintained for years was now exposed. And worse, he knew that Vivian and Eleanor had already anticipated this moment, controlling the narrative before anyone else could react. The room buzzed with tension, a fragile chaos that threatened to erupt at any moment. I felt my pulse racing, adrenaline coursing through me. I had uncovered the note, witnessed the manipulations, and now I was in the epicenter of a storm far beyond my imagination. Every glance, every gesture, every whispered word held consequences. Then came the unexpected. The man with the document turned toward me. His eyes were calculating, piercing. "You've seen too much," he said quietly, almost a statement, almost a threat. My stomach dropped. I realized then that I wasn't just a witness anymore, I was a target. Knowledge, I had learned, was dangerous. And possessing it made me vulnerable in ways I couldn't yet quantify. Vivian's voice broke through the tension, calm and commanding. "Let him speak," she said. Her eyes met mine for just a second, an unspoken warning, a reminder that every move I made would be observed, every reaction noted. I felt the weight of her presence like a physical force pressing down on me. The man began to speak, revealing the final layer of deception, betrayal, and manipulation that had been hidden behind smiles and polite conversation. Every word sent ripples through the room. Marcus's composure cracked. The woman in green turned pale. Julian's hands tightened around his glass, knuckles white. The stakes had shifted. This was no longer a social power play. This was a reckoning. And then, the moment that made my heart seize, the man pointed directly at Julian. He thought he could manipulate everyone, he said, voice sharp. He underestimated the consequences. Julian's eyes widened, and the room held its collective breath. Vivian's smile was unchanged, calm, and predatory. Eleanor's whispers to her continued, subtle but precise, guiding the storm. And in that instant, I realized that the hidden threat, the one I had sensed all evening, wasn't just a revelation. It was a weapon, and it had been unleashed. I felt a chill run through me. The storm wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that what came next would change everything, and no one, not Julian, not Marcus, not Eleanor, not even Vivian, could predict the full impact. The room was alive with tension, with fear, with anticipation. Every secret had been revealed, yet the most dangerous truth, the one that could topple all alliances, was still waiting, hidden just out of sight, ready to strike. And I realized, with a shiver that ran down my spine, that the night's final revelation, the one that would leave no one unscathed, was about to be exposed.